Okay, well, we'll get started with blanket purchase order workflow. It covers mostly, the two different workflows that you can create a blanket purchase order, which is standard purchase requisitions and service requisitions. We're gonna focus on that, and you've attended the standard purchase requisition. It's gonna follow that format quite a bit. Here's the agenda we'll go through today with a general overview of this, the approval workflows. We'll go through actually doing a purchase requisition as a blanket purchase order. The documents them to, which is purchase order and a voucher, and of course the closed partial PO. We'll talk a little bit about attachments, and if we have time at the end, I'll show printing and emailing purchasing documents if you ever had to send those to your vendors. So first, we start off with this little table that kind of summarizes these workflows. So on the far left, we have the document that creates a commitment, which would be the standard purchase requisition or the contract services requisition. And once that's approved, we see the status. We'll have journal entries made, expenses in our encumbrance control to say that we've now have an encumbrance for purchase order and contract services purchase order documents have no direct impact on our general ledger. Whether that's the document in a pending status, partially converted, draft, or in progress, purchase orders don't affect the general ledger. It's just a middleman basically between the requisition and the payment. And we'll go the document that releases commitments and post expenses are vouchers or justifications, and those are approved. We see it's saying closed, and we see two different types of journal entries that are going to happen. First set is the release of the encumbrance, and when that is done, the second one is going to be the post of the expense, and those in two different journal entries. And the last, the closed partial purchase order, it's a type of document that releases commitment and posts no expense. We're telling Intacct we are done with the purchase order, we're no longer using it, close it out, and release that related encumbrance. Document states I have gone through. It's a document that's saved as a draft. We can start working on a purchasing document, and if we're not finished or we don't have all the documents we need yet, we can click it as draft. It's helpful if you run into an issue. That way, if you reach out to me for help with something, I can look exactly at the thing that you're having difficulty with. In progress is a document that's been converted, but the next document was saved as a draft. Basically, if we had converted our purchase order into a voucher, save the voucher as a draft, the purchase order will say it's in progress. So our purchase order list views, if we're there, we see anything in progress, that's a flag to us that we have a voucher we haven't completed, and we need to go take a look and see what that is. Any document waiting action by a user, actually converted, a blanket PO that's been converted, but not all of the quantity field has been used. Document that's been converted to the next document and all of the quantity was utilized. And we'll get into that shortly. Closed, meaning the payment request is fully approved. It's moved on to accounts payable. It's with the first approver in the workflow. Decline, one of the approvers has declined. And the last state we may see is partially approved, meaning workflow has multiple approvers. The first person is approved, and it's waiting for approvals from anyone else after that first approver. Our general view: does a purchasing transaction impact the general ledger? When all approvers in the workflow have approved, any time before. So this, the budget availability on your report or when you use the Spend Insight button is not affected until after a document is approved. So we need to watch out for multiple submissions you think are within budget. And of course, your report, check them often and check them again. And basically what that's saying is, if we have a $100 budget and we've submitted a $90 request, so it doesn't affect our budget. Having it approved does. If I submit a $90 request on a $100 budget, we would expect to have $10 left to spend. But it's continue to submit requests until one of those things gets approved. So you want to keep that in mind as we submit documents and we're tracking our requests at what state they're in. Are they in submitted, partially approved, that kind of stuff, so we can anticipate what the impact on our budget will be. And we're not surprised when we've submitted multiple things and an approver down the line can approve now because we ran out of budget. This is do not clear until after the payment request is approved. And that's assuming documents have been converted correctly. And we'll take a look at what I mean by that when I start creating an example for us to see. After submitting purchasing request, getting approval, just please make sure to follow up by checking your financial reports. Did the encumbrance happen that we expected to? Are post as we expect them to? Did the encumbrance release as we expected it to? Purchase reports if we need to. And then check them again to make sure we're right. We don't ever want to be surprised, and especially on like encumbrance releases, if we didn't format our stuff correctly, it's better to catch now rather than in the last couple of days of your reporting cycle to the funding agency. And to be, everyone else's responsibility to go look for that when we've had months to look. And this is the accounting manual policy blanket purchase orders that kind of set before we're going to go through. And with 1 point, blanket purchase orders may be used in the instance of recurring monthly expenses, including electricity, telephone, and rent. The purchase order may be estimated for 1 month or the entire year, depending on the preference of the division head or program director. Blanket may be used in the instance of programs needing various and numerous supplies during a month. These purchase orders may be estimated for a 1 month period and would be in file with the applicable vendor. So let's look at the approval flow for what we're going to get into. Status recommendations. And all these documents will begin with the same thing. User submits this request. So a program user is going to have standard purchase requisition or contract services requisition that they'll prepare. When they submit the request, the state will change to submitted. By doing, there is no effect on the general ledger, no debits, no credits. So we have a question, do we have a new accounting manual? Not at this time, it's still the one that's been in existence for quite a while. We prepare our request, it must satisfy the before we can submit. So if we have a $100 budget and we may have prepare a $110 request that would exceed the budget, we would get an error saying we need to reduce the transaction or contact the budget administrator, which would be the person responsible for your program or your budget. Meets the budget, it goes on to the person, which is the program approver or your program monitor. They have to decline or approve. Once they take action, the document will change from submitted to either declined if they declined it, or to partially approved if they've approved it. And I'm sorry, program approver is the program director. When the program director approves, it moves forward to the monitor, and still no activity has taken place on our finances yet. No general ledger. Now the program monitor can review. The status will say partially approved until they take action. And they decline return it back to the user, approve. And if they approve, the document status goes to pending, and depending on your preferences in Intacct, you'll receive an email from Intacct telling you that the request has been approved, and all entry takes place automatically. That we'll have an encumbrance hit. In this example, I gave office supplies, and then encumbrance control will have the same amount you've requested also affected by that. Services requisition is a much bigger workflow, but starts off with the same ones. And so we have the user, the program approver, and the program monitor all have the exact same responsibility for a standard purchase requisition. Except the difference here is if the monitor approves, taken on our general ledger, instead that moves forward to the CFO. The CFO has the same choices to make as the program monitor. They can decline or approve. And if they goes forward to the treasurer, document status continues to stay at partially approved. Once this goes to the treasurer, have the same options, decline or approve. If they, this will move forward to the president. And then finally, the president will have opportunity to review, and they can either decline or approve also. Their approval will change the CSR to a pending status and post the journal entry for the encumbrance. I give the example of the contractual line item, which is what most of us would use when we use the contract workflow. Point any of these users, decline the document, it goes into a decline status and returns to the person who created the request. And we're also just the voucher workflow. Whether it's a purchase order or a contract service purchase order, a user is going to convert that document to one of those, and it'll go to a submitted status. They'll have the choices to decline or approve, and then the last person will be the finance manager who will make the decision to approve or decline as well. And once that's approved, the encumbrance will be cleared and the expense will post, and then off to accounts payable will go for payment processing. Approvers cannot edit a document. It's important because we have to utilize certain fields, and failure to use them correctly will cause delays. So we'll talk about the vendor document number when I get to processing a voucher. And since these have to be unique for each vendor, we have to make sure whatever we're using we hadn't used before. And then, of course, we have class dimension, which may be required on certain account numbers. So we have to make sure those are used too. So as those are going through the workflow, if any of the approvers see that these aren't being used, there's nothing they can do about that. They'd have to decline it so you can make the correction that needs to be corrected. And in the case of Lynette, when she's approving a voucher, if the vendor document number repeats, she gets an error message that says it's been used before, so she'll have to decline so that number can be changed. And just keep in mind that declines start the process over, which can be pretty frustrating on a contract workflow, considering how many different approvers there are. And a reminder that the budget is verified when a user submits a purchasing transaction. So does the line item for your funding source have the funds available to accommodate your request? And upon submission, your budget is not affected. Budgets are affected when the request is fully approved. Important to understand, because we can submit multiple requests that meet the budget, but in totality might exceed your available balance. And so for those of us who've experienced something like that, and we see it happen in contracts, and especially in travel though, we might submit a bunch of different transactions that aren't declined because they're meeting the budget. Then once one of them gets approved, it'll leave the others unable to be approved because now the budget is no longer available. which can be frustrating for, of course, every user, and especially the approvers, because now they can approve our requests. So just keep that in mind. Our budget isn't affected until our request is fully approved. So now we'll get out of the PowerPoint and we'll actually get into Intacct. If you have questions, please use the chat box in the bottom right of your screen so we can answer those as we go along. Okay, so I'm gonna do this by giving an example with the standard purchase requisition, which we can all find under the purchasing menu, going to quote, and either clicking standard purchase requisition, which will take us to the list of those that have what we have access to. Well, there'll be a list of all of that activity, or we can click the plus sign to just go right into creating a document. So that's what I'm going to do. And one of the first things we can see over here, the date is highlighted. So that's one of the first things we have to address as a user. Sometimes users assume the cursor starts in the vendor field instead of up here. And that can cause a problem with the date on a document. In Intacct, there are shortcut keys that can affect the date. The letter R is the most commonly used letter to begin all of the vendors that we have. And so often we don't realize our cursor's in the date field. We type in R, and in the date field now, my date has changed from today to 12/31 of 21. So just keep that in mind. If we didn't want to use the end of a calendar year as our date, just make sure that when we start on this page, we actually click into the vendor field. In the slideshow I'm going through, it's available either on my website, and when the session's over, I'll make sure to email this to you guys. I have a page that has all the different keys that you can use to change the date just by typing a letter. So once we've made sure that we're using today's date or the appropriate date we need to accrue the transaction to, now we can address the vendor. So for those of us who have used Intacct before know that the vendor's name starts popping up as we start typing letters as Intacct reads us from left to right. And so we can start typing these letters. Intacct starts telling us who matches. And if we see what we're looking for, we can select a vendor. If we do not see the vendor we're looking for by typing this way, we all have an option called Find. So I'm gonna go ahead and click Find. And it'll take us to a list of vendors. If we've typed letters like I have here, it's gonna show us the same amount. If we had nothing in the vendor field and it was blank and we started the find process, it'll take us to a list of the 15,000 vendors currently active and Intacct. And so we now have our option to start searching for a vendor by the name. So we can start typing and it'll only read from left to right. So unless we know the name exactly, that might become a problem. But if we knew the vendor had the name Test in it, but we just weren't sure if the business started with Test or Test was somewhere else in the company name, we can start our request by typing a % sign. And that makes it like a wildcard. So now when I initiate the search, it's going to look for every vendor that has Test in its name at any point in the vendor name. So now our responsive has gone from 3 to 11. So we can see American Engineering Testing, National Test Systems, Mid-Continent Testing Lab, and Geotech Engineering and Testing Services have been added to this. So as long as this combination appears in the name, it'll bring that up for everybody. And so from there, we can select the vendor we want to use. If the vendor does not come up, so we've now made our best efforts, we can't find a vendor, everyone will have access to an area where we can add a new vendor request and make that request that we need the new vendor we're trying to do business with. Once we've selected it, we can now start to work on the middle section of our request. Terms pretty much autofill, which autofills the expiration date for us. Areas we really don't need to worry about what they are, but expiration date does mean something. Ultimately, these have no bearing on our requests or how they get processed. At the request stage, at a purchase requisition, or if it's a contract services requisition, the vendor document number isn't important yet. So this, we're not going to worry about completing at this stage of the request. If we have a message we need to share internally for people who are going to review this document, or we want the message to appear on the documents we're going to print, it's our opportunity to do that here. We can choose how we want to ship the payment. So there's options for program will pick up, or for the finance office to mail. You can choose. Purchase requisition isn't going to result in a payment yet, so we can leave that blank. Attachments is another field that, of course, basically every request we have is going to result in some sort of attachment to support the request. So we'll make this order here. Did some attachments. In our purchase acquisition stage or contract acquisition, we're allowed to have an EPLS as an attachment. Contract, we may have the initially proposed contract, and then anything else that would support the request we're making. Ready to attach those, we can attach those in one of two ways. I find the easiest is to grab the document on your desktop, hold it above the attachment field, and let it go. One file I've attached is now done, and now the attachment folder has been numbered, and the document I've dropped there is sitting there. I know it's attached. If we have multiple documents we want to attach, I can just drag another one. And so those are the easiest ways to attach the attachments. Once we're done, we can click the paper clip and see the different ones I've attached, and then I can click on them to make sure they open, they're readable. I've them named in a way that makes sense for other people. And from there, be happy. If we want to add other ones, we can drag and drop, or you can click when you have the attachment dialog box open, and then desktop or other folders you have on your computer to find the document and add it. Now to start with our entries. Whatever program you have access to, I'm going to use one I call Test Company. Funding's appropriate for you to use. Use the code that you'll be using if it's utilities, if it's a contract, the proper classification of our request. Regular, since this won't have anything to do with any form of COVID spending. If we're doing a 3-month blanket purchase order or year, whatever it is, we could use the memo field to describe that. You can say right through April PO. Blanket POs, the quantity field is where we're going to use the sum of our estimate. So if it was this $10 a month estimate, I may put 30 as the quantity. And so whatever the estimate's going to be for you, that full amount should be listed in the quantity field. Our price will then be $1, and then Intacct will do the math for us and extend that price by multiplying quantity by price. This is the most efficient way of doing a blanket PO. Sometimes we see program users will put in the amount and then the price as 12 if they wanted it as 12 months, or the number of months they're doing, which is fine. But if we run into an issue that the price or the quantity isn't working out how we anticipated, that can cause problems in converting your documents. If we use the full quantity as the full value and the price as 1, it'll avoid some issues later on down the road if your prices change, your contract changes. So this is the best way to do this. Once we have this done, we're ready to submit. We have our vendor, we have our attachments. I filled in all the information that we want to charge this request to. We have a spend insight button. So, use this. So if I hit show spend insight, it's going to show the budget for this line item and the budget only. So I know I have a $100 budget. There's been no expenses, so the actual total is 0. I don't have any open purchase orders, so my committed expenditures is 0. This request is for $30. So when this goes through, the funds available when it's approved will be $70. If this request exceeded our budget, it'll tell us we don't have enough funds available by $50 for the request. So this is a quick, easy way to look at your budget and know what's going to happen before it does. Know the effect of this, especially if we're doing multiple requests. I know now that there's $70 left, and if my next request is $70 or more, I'm in some trouble. So let's get this back to 30. And now we can submit our request. All right. So we can see I have one pending request from all the 3 I've done in the years we've had Intacct. And once we're prepared, it'd be our responsibility as a program user to convert this document into the next document, which purchase requisition becomes a purchase order. So we'll have the word convert on any of these lines where the documents are waiting for us to take action. We only have one option from a purchase requisition, so we can click on purchase order. At this stage, when we're making it a purchase order, we want to make absolutely no changes to this document. There is no reason for us to do so. We want to have the full amount, everything that we've created at the purchase requisition, we want to go into the purchase order. Post this. Now my reverted is concerned. My job is done for my blanket PO for test tester. So now we'll go to the purchase orders. Under purchasing order, purchase order. And we'll filter. I have one pending purchase order. So now what steps are we going to take with it? If it's time to make our payment, our first $10 allotment, since we made this a 3-month purchase order, we have 3 options when we can convert this: close, partial PO, justification, or voucher. If we use close partial PO, it closes the document. It does not send it forward for payment. If I exceeded the approved request, I could use justification, and then I would need the appropriate justification request that's approved to send that forward. In this case, in our perfect world example, it's going to be less than the amount requested. So it's a normal request. I'm going to use voucher. Like the purchase requisition, the cursor starts in the date field. And it always begins with the current date. Whatever day it is, that's the date that's going to be there, which for 90% of what we're doing, the date will never need to be changed. The only time we'll have to be mindful of that is when our fiscal year is ending. So if your program works on the tribe's fiscal year and it's October, but we need to accrue this stuff to September, we'll need to be mindful of the date. So we can't change the vendor at this point. So we've committed our document, all our approvals to this vendor. So we don't have to make any changes here. The first area we'll be concerned with is this vendor document number. This needs to be unique to the vendor. In my folders, I have my February invoice, February 2021, testing vendor invoice 123. Nice and easy document. So that's the vendor document number I'm going to use. Might have February 21, invoice 123. Likely that's not something I'm going to use for this vendor again. So that vendor document number should be good. We're limited to 40 characters in this field. So there's plenty of room for you to use something unique. We can't use special symbols, so be careful of like ampersands or slashes and stuff. You might get an error that says it's formatted incorrectly. So just try and stick with numbers and letters. So we've got our vendor document number. This is going to be required on any payment requests. There was a message we needed to include. Program's going to pick this up. Our attachments. At this point, we shouldn't have had an invoice yet, right? We've made a request for a purchase order. So now we're going to slide the February invoice over. So now I've got February attached. We can see what the purchase order amount was, this $30. So let's get this back to normal size. In fiscal year end, it's our current year, so we'll choose current. Here, we don't need to make any changes to this stuff. Program funding source checkbook, our item ID, we should not make any changes to. This will affect those original encumbrances we've made, because when this looks to release this after it's approved, it's looking for the matching data. What we want to look at changing is the quantity field. If this was a $10 invoice, just exactly as we planned, I'm going to change that 30 to 10. And if there's anything else we need to do, any other attachments that we think we need to add, if it's from a contractor, we might have their statement of work, their invoice, depending on the type of contract you have with the person, something that's going to justify releasing those funds to them. I know some contracts might be a percentage is due on approval of the contract, so that might be something you're processing as a voucher. And so once we're ready to go, we can send this forward. But I'm going to change the vendor document number just in case accounts payable is working, because when I submit this, it's going to auto approve. I want them to see that it's a test thing, so don't approve it. So once we're ready to go, we can submit. I'm back to the purchase order field. My request is partially converted. So let's take a look at our PO now. This tells us where it originated from. Here's our standard purchase requisition. The original approved amount, $30. Here's our attachments. Here's the state that says partially converted. So any of us as a user looking at our list of purchase orders, we see partially converted, we know that's a blanket PO sitting out there. And now when we look at the line of the purchase order, here's that quantity of 30, but now we have a new column that's been added, quantity converted. So now looking at this, I know, okay, we've used 10 of the $30 that we've gotten approved for this. So I know there's 20 bucks left I can convert for the next month's payment. Or if we were done, the purchase order doesn't have to be used as far out as we think it did, so we didn't fully exhaust the quantity field. I'm done here, I still have $20 I need to close out, and I can convert the PO into a closed partial PO, so I can release the remaining $20 off of my encumbrances. All right, so if you have questions, by all means, please use your chat box down at the bottom there. Once we're ready to pay again, so now it's March, we can come back to our document, convert this into a new voucher. So maybe we have March 1st as our date. We can see the purchase order amount is still $30, but this is our new voucher for March. We've paid that 10 bucks in February. When we see the line down here, now it tells us what's available. The quantity is 20. So if our invoice exceeded 20, flag to us that we can't use voucher, we should be using a justification because we've underestimated the amount of the bills, and what we had approved was to spend $30 on this blanket purchase order. But again, perfect world, 10 bucks. And so now we have a choice because we need to address the attachments. We need to add our March invoice. But I want to show you something here. When I click view attachment, even though I'm starting to work on March, the February invoice is there too. So as long as we keep linking our request and our blanket POs together, and then the subsequent vouchers for those blanket POs, all the attachments that we put in this folder are going to chain together with all of those requests, which is fine. Let's just make sure that as we add our attachments, we use a name that makes sense so that the people who are reviewing this to approve, they know which one it is. Because if we have a 12-month blanket PO for Golden West or Cherry Powder, whoever, and we're not naming our documents, we're either scanning them so it has that long scanner serial number that's auto-assigned. It can be difficult for the people who review your transactions to know, well, which one do you actually mean for this month? So we've got that stuff here. So just make sure we keep that. Make it easier for everyone. So now I want to attach my March voucher. I've got my March voucher here, so I just drop it into the attachment field. We can update the vendor document number. To include that, fiscal year end would be current. And then we can submit this. I'm going to change this to test though before I submit it also. And hopefully I type that exact as the same one, because I should get an error if I submit this. This is the error Lynette gets when she tries to approve documents if we've repeated the vendor document number. So it'll tell her transaction with the number test already exists for that vendor. So Intacct can't allow this document to go any further. When she's reviewing to approve, she can't make that change either. So just make sure that we do that. That we make sure that that's unique. Our PO is still partially converted. We started with a quantity of 30. We've converted 20 of it. So once we're getting ready to pay the month of April, if we've estimated correctly, as I have in my pretend example, then we'll be fine for the next $10 installment. If we're done at this point, and let's say we are, we've made that determination, we're no longer going to use this. I know there's an amount available. It's now our responsibility as the program user to convert this to a closed partial PO. Now it'll go right through with the amount that's still available to close out. So really no reason for us to make a change in the quantity. This is the balance of what hasn't been used. The date may be important depending on the time of the year. Same thing as before. If we're past our fiscal year and this is a prior year purchase order, we may need to change the date to 9/30 or to whatever the last day of your fiscal year is, depending on the funding that you have. Like I know Head Start has different fiscal years than us. Diabetes runs on a different fiscal year, transportation. So I think we run out there with 5 different fiscal years, depending on the type of funds you have. And this also ensures that when I close this, the encumbrance will release in the same year the encumbrance was created. And if we're not careful with that, we may end up with the end of our year with an encumbrance, and the next year we'll start with a credit, which may allow us to accidentally overspend. So I'm going to use an April date for this one. When you close a partial PO, there is no approval process. So how it is formatted is entirely on your shoulders. No one else is going to see this. So when you click post, that's it. The document is done. Your PO will be fully converted. And the amount that's going to close and the date, it will post the way you've told Intacct to do it. We're going to get the message I put out there to say, please make sure the transaction date you are using is for the correct fiscal year. If it is correct, go ahead and click post. So now we click post to ignore that rule. Here is my PO. Let me get rid of all the other ones that are sitting out there so we can just look at just the one. That state is now converted. So if we're looking at our list of purchase orders, anything that says converted for the purchase order, we know all the next steps that had to be taken has been taken for this purchase order. It's been converted to a voucher or to a justification or to a closed partial PO. So we would know that as the purchase order is concerned, our work is done for that specific purchase order. If we're not sure what documents it could be related to, we can view the purchase order, and at the top we get a tab for history. And it'll tell us, here's that initial request I started at the beginning of this. Here's the purchase order. Here's the 2 vouchers, the February and March voucher. And here's that closed partial PO I used and used the April date. So we can see over here the document dates. There's my March, there's my February, and then there's April. At no point will Intacct automatically close your purchase orders if you haven't fully exhausted the quantity field. So it doesn't matter if it's 1 penny or 1,000,000 pennies. The responsibility is on the program to make sure their purchase orders are closed and closed for the proper period. Let's take a look at the vouchers I've created. So under purchasing, I'm going to invoice and to voucher. So here's the 2 vouchers. I'm using a custom view. You can use this. Most of us will be on just an all view, which will have less information, but this allows me to see who created it, totals, the total paid, the payment status, the current year-end date, and the GL posting date. It just gives us some more information about what we're requesting. So I know, looking at this right now, these 2 requests haven't been paid. So if we've submitted our vouchers and we know that we've gotten the 2 approvals we need, our monitor and Lynette, we want to know where it stands, we can come right here and take a look. It hasn't been paid, status is open. So we know that accounts payable hasn't gotten the treasurer's approval yet to pay or haven't printed a check. Let's take a look at one of these vouchers. Once we create a voucher, we get a new tab that gets added. We have the history tab, just like we do for any of the other documents, but we also now get payment details. And so we can click here, and if this had been paid, the total paid would change to the amount paid, our $10 request, and a new box shows up that gives us the check number that's related to the payment. So then we would know, okay, check number 1 has made this payment. I'm good. Or now I know it's ready, I've requested to pick it up, so now I can make my way to finance to get this payment. When we make our request for payments, whether it's the voucher or a justification, there are 2 fields that when we type end up on a check stub. One is this vendor document number. So not only do we have to make it unique, we need to make sure it's usable and meaningful to anyone who's going to look at a check stub. So that would likely be your vendor. And whatever we put in this memo field is also going to show up on our check stubs. So if we want to make sure we get some extra information there for who's going to receive our checks from us, just make sure the vendor document number in the memo, number 1, that the vendor document number is unique to the vendor, but meaningful too, and that the memo field can be used to add extra information if we need it. You know, so if it's Head Start making a payment for all their sites, they might have one for their Head Start centers in Antelope and Rosebud and anywhere else they have them. And so it might say that. Or if we have multiple utility bills to pay, maybe the memo field, each line is going to have account 1, account 2, account 3, that kind of stuff. That way, when the vendor gets it, they can see in the statement all the lines we've added and the accounts that it would be for. Any questions? Okay. So if we want to print these documents, we're all probably pretty familiar with the choice of at the end of each one, we have the option to print/email. And so we can hit print and it comes out to a PDF. So whether you're making a record for yours, saving it to your desktop, or actually printing it, you can do that. We have the option to email. So if the vendor has an email in their profile, that email will fill in. If they don't, then you just have to type it. And copy other people. So if there's a secondary person from the company you have contact with, so a lot of the larger corporations might have a general email that they receive billing to, like billing@whatever.com. So maybe there's a certain person you want to see it, or another person in your program. You want to make sure they get a copy, you can do that. And the last thing I want to see is the name here. It's always going to default to me, since as the system administrator, I'm the default contact for the tribe. Anytime you use this option, make sure you change the name and email address to your own. Occasionally, I'll catch an email from a vendor asking me questions about POs or vouchers and stuff, and it just wastes a little bit of time of them being able to contact you directly. So we can do that one at a time, or if we had multiple requests under purchasing, you can go to print or email transactions. Address your email and name up here, your phone number that they can contact you at. And so if we're going to use those 2 vouchers, say we wanted to print them all at the same time and not have to find them one by one, I might have to use the February to April timeframe. Likely we would have printed them before. So let's make sure we've used previously sent just in case. Use our testing vendor. I think that's the one I used. Your checkbook. And then do we want to print stuff that's posted, stuff that's drafted, or both? Important designations, because if it's only partially approved, that doesn't qualify as either of those explanations. It's got to be fully approved. And then what type of transaction is it going to be? And it'll have the list of all the purchasing transactions we have. So I'll select voucher. We want to use the voucher. Actually, I'm going to leave purchase order on too. And once we have those ready to go, we can click view. I don't remember which testing vendor it was. Maybe it's test tester. Okay. So now we can see our purchase order and the 2 vouchers. Easy way to find those 3 things all at the same time. If we want to print, we can check mark whichever ones we want to print at once. Or you can hit the little green arrow up here and it'll select it all for you if you're doing it in this, like a lot of lines here. We can see the email has filled in for the contact for test tester. And so if we want to email it to, we can select that or just do one or the other, up to you. Punch in anyone else's emails that we want to copy this to or to blind copy it to. And then once we're ready, just click print email, and whichever boxes we've selected, Intacct will begin taking those actions. If we're printing, it's going to want to print as a PDF. So if you try using this option, and you're not getting a pop-up of the PDF, you may need to check the settings on your browser to make sure PDF is allowed to pop up. So like for me, I got nothing that come up. But we also got a message that says, go to purchase order reports, my stored reports to retrieve the PDF file. So once those documents are prepared, you'd get an email from Intacct saying your stored reports are ready. So let's take a look at the email. Dear Intacct, your request to print email documents offline is complete. Please go to purchasing reports, my stored reports to view or download the documents. Purchase reports, stored report. Here's my PO and my voucher. PDF. Here it is. So a nice organize your requests if you're going to print them. A mass email them to somebody else. Of course, you can always mail them to yourself. We've reached an hour. Questions have come into the box. So as long as any other questions, thank you all for your time. Have a good rest of the day.